Hi everyone, my name is Carol Binder. I'm an economics professor at Haverford College, and I do a lot of teaching and research about the Federal Reserve and monetary policy. So it was big news for me a few days ago when the Federal Reserve announced a new policy that they call average inflation targeting. And so I'm making a video for my classes, but also for anyone who's interested to explain a little bit about what average inflation targeting is and how the Fed got there. And here with me, I have my daughter Felicity. She's not quite 2 months old. She's my fourth baby, but my first one to be in an economics video. And she might be excited to be here. She might just, she might stay quiet for us, we'll see. But let's get into this about average inflation targeting. So I think we need to start with a bit of background about inflation in the United States. Well, in the United States, this is showing a history of consumer price index inflation. And all the graphs that I'm going to be using in this video, I made at Fred. And I have another video about how you can use Fred in case you're interested. But this is showing the percent change from a year ago in CPI inflation, starting even before 1920. So this series goes pretty far back. And I'm just showing you how, especially in the past, the United States has had very volatile inflation with sometimes above 20% inflation, sometimes negative inflation or deflation. Let's zoom in on a couple of examples here. So in World War I, for example, the US experienced very high inflation. And then, as I've discussed in another video, in the Great Depression, we had deflation. And that was actually a big problem. Part of what made the Depression last so long was that there was this problem of deflation and deflationary expectations. Okay, skipping way ahead, what you've probably heard of is what's called stagflation, a combination of high inflation and high unemployment that occurred in the 1970s and early 80s. And then I have a picture here of Paul Volcker, who was the chairman during the early 80s and responsible for what we call the Volcker disinflation, when that high inflation was brought down, but importantly, it was brought down with a major recession. So the Fed had to tighten monetary policy to bring inflation down, and of course, tightening monetary policy also led to a recession. But after that Volcker disinflation, which I'm showing again over here, after that Volcker disinflation, then we had this period that is usually called the Great Moderation. You see inflation was lower, it was more stable, less volatile. Then so the shaded gray bars are recessions, and this one here is the Great Recession. You can see a big dip in inflation. We had a short period of deflation, and then we've had low inflation ever since. You see another gray bar, that's the start of the ongoing COVID-19 recession. Okay, so inflation targeting. Inflation targeting was first adopted by the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Central Bank, in the late 1980s. And after the Reserve Bank of New Zealand adopted inflation targeting, a lot of other central banks around the world followed suit in the 1990s. The US was not formally one of them, although it was influenced by the idea of inflation targeting, which is to pick and announce a numerical target for inflation, and that becomes the goal of the central bank, is keep inflation near that target over some time horizon. The Fed never announced any explicit target for inflation. Remember, it has its dual mandate for price, in terms of price stability and employment. So it has two different goals, but it never, set a numerical goal for inflation explicitly until January 2012, when you see this text at the bottom here, comes from the FOMC on 2012. They said, with respect to the objective of price stability, the committee judges that inflation at the rate of 2%, as measured by the annual change in the price index for personal consumption expenditures, is most consistent over the longer run with our statutory mandate. Okay, remember, so the graph the graphs of inflation that I was showing you earlier were CPI, Consumer Price Index inflation, because that data series goes back quite far, but the Fed actually sets its target in terms of PCE inflation. I'm showing you both on this graph. The red line is PCE inflation, and that's actually tends to always be a little lower than CPI inflation. But you can see here in 2012 is when the Fed announced that 2% PCE inflation was its target. And here's the 2% line. So PCE inflation has almost always been below the target ever since the target was announced. Okay, so the target would be this line here, and PCE inflation has been below it. So this has led Fed watchers, people who think about the Fed and wonder about the Fed, to ask, is the Fed's inflation target symmetric, or is it more like a ceiling? Is the Fed really trying to keep inflation around 2% on either side, but they don't, they mind deviations above just as much as they mind deviations below? Or do they really just care about keeping inflation below 2%? And if you were to just look at what they're doing, it sort of looks like, well, maybe the 2% target is a ceiling because they tend to stay below it. But the FOMC in 2016 amended their statement on longer run goals and monetary policy strategy to say the committee would be concerned if inflation were running persistently above or below this objective. So they were trying to communicate, this 2% target is a symmetric target, it's not a ceiling. That didn't really convince everyone though. The next year in 2017, President Charles Evans of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago said that, well, I'm concerned that persistent factors are holding down inflation. Namely, the public's inflation expectations appear to me to have drifted down below the FOMC's 2% symmetric inflation target. In order to dispel any impression that 2% is a ceiling, our communication should be much clearer about our willingness to deliver on a symmetric inflation outcome, acknowledging a greater chance of inflation at 2.5% in the future than what has been communicated in the past. So you see he was saying, we've said that this target is symmetric, but people don't really seem to believe that. They still expect inflation that's a little lower than 2%. And we'll talk about why that matters, okay? Here, this is from the Atlanta Fed, and some researchers there did a survey of businesses and asked them, do you think that the Fed is more likely to accept inflation above its target or below its target, or is it equally likely to accept inflation above or below its target? And so more of the respondents thought that the Fed was more likely to accept inflation below its target than above. So again, this is some evidence that, and as of 2017, that decision makers at firms didn't really think that 2% target was symmetric. They thought it was more like a ceiling. The Fed would prefer to keep inflation below rather than let it get above. Okay, so now we're getting to what happened a few days ago, and I'm making this video on, I think it's September 1st. The days sort of run together when you have 4 babies in the house all the time. But so a few days ago, on August 27th, the FOMC again amended that statement on longer run goals and monetary policy strategy. So it says, the committee judges that the level of the federal funds rate consistent with maximum employment and price stability over the longer run has declined. Therefore, the Fed funds rate is likely to be constrained by its effective lower bound more frequently in the past. We'll talk about what this means also. The committee judges that downward risks to employment and inflation have increased. In other words, it's more likely that things that will bring employment down and bring inflation down have increased. The committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. That's the key here, averages 2% over time, and therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Okay, so that's the big announcement, that when inflation has been persistently below 2%, the Fed wants average inflation to be 2%, so they will make up for that shortfall by letting inflation go above 2% for some time. They don't say exactly for what time, but for some time. Okay, so that's how they've phrased what they're going to be doing, their average inflation targeting. And let's talk about what that would mean. So this comes from David Beckworth at, it's something he wrote at the Mercatus Center. And he's giving two examples, two versions of a 2% inflation target. So the first row here, you have ordinary inflation target, something like what the Fed has been trying to do. And say they had done pretty well getting their 2% target for 2 years in a row. But then year 3, something happens. So there's some sort of bad shock to the economy, and we get a year of deflation. Well, what does the Fed do in that case in the future? It still tries to hit 2%. Maybe it succeeds even in year 4, 5, 6, and 7 at doing exactly what it says it wants to do, which is get 2% inflation. So after 7 years, the average inflation rate there would be 1.57%. Okay, now a central bank that was doing average inflation targeting, maybe they also hit 2% inflation in year 1 and 2. They also get that bad shock in year 3. Well, what do they need to do? They want average inflation to be 2%. So they're going to compensate for that negative 1% year by letting inflation go above 2% for 2 years in a row. And at the end of 7 years, average inflation is 2%. So David Beckworth also gives two graphs to show you what this would look like. In the first, now these are from the same numbers as we saw in the chart. The ordinary inflation target, we see the price level here on the y-axis. So if the price level is 100 at the start, it goes up by 2% each year. Then here's the year where we get negative 1% inflation, and the price level falls below this trend path, which would be growing at 2%. After that, the Fed doesn't try to bring the price level back up to the trend path, but just starts a new trend path that's also growing at a rate of 2% per year. With an average inflation target, we see the price levels growing along the 2% trend path. We get the year of deflation, then we let the price level grow faster until we get back up to the trend path. Okay, so that's a representation of the difference between the type of inflation targeting policy that the Fed was trying to follow before and the one that they say they're trying to follow from now on. In both cases, this is sort of assuming that after we get that bad year, the central bank can achieve the inflation rate that it wants. So after that year of deflation, this central bank in this example was able to resume 2% inflation each year. And here, after that year of negative 1% inflation, the central bank was able to achieve 2 years of above 2% inflation. Okay. I just wanted to note that the Fed is not the very first central bank to ever do average inflation targeting, although it's one of the first, but the Reserve Bank of Australia does phrase their inflation target this way. The governor and the treasurer have agreed that the appropriate target for monetary policy in Australia is to achieve an inflation rate of 2 to 3% on average over time. So the Reserve Bank of Australia does also do some average inflation targeting. Now let's look at what a couple of other economists have said about average inflation targeting. From the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, some researchers there wrote an explanation about average inflation targeting as a response to the effective lower bound. Note they wrote this before the Fed actually announced that it was going to do average inflation targeting, but it had been hinted at, so there's a lot of expectation that this announcement might occur. They say in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Fed cut the federal funds rate to essentially zero. The Fed funds rate, again, it's a nominal short-term interest rate that the Fed uses for monetary policy. Nevertheless, the economic downturn is putting downward pressure on inflation, which had already been running below the Fed's 2% target for several years. This raises additional concerns that inflation expectations could decline and push inflation down further, ultimately hampering economic activity. A monetary framework based on average inflation targeting could help address these challenges. Now, let's talk about what this means. So remember, and I made another video about the Fisher effect in the Great Depression, but remember, the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus inflation, or R, the real interest rate, equals I minus pi. But another way that we write this is the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. And in my other video, I talked about how this first version, the real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus inflation, that's called the ex post real interest rate. But what consumption and investment decisions depend on is the ex ante real interest rate. What's the real interest rate that people are working with at the time they're making those decisions? Well, they look at the nominal interest rate and subtract what they expect inflation to be. And that's the interest rate that's relevant to most consumption and investment decisions. Okay, so this is named after Irving Fisher, an economist during the Great Depression. And remember, as I said, in the Great Depression, there was deflation. So this pi e, expected inflation, became negative once people started anticipating the deflation. When pi e is negative, then negative pi e is positive, and that raises the real interest rate, which reduces consumption and investment. Okay, so that's why I said that deflation during the Great Depression was a problem, because deflationary expectations got built in and raised the real interest rate. So even though nominal interest rates were not really that high, we still had relatively tight conditions as far as consumption and investment being dampened. Okay, so we could get into it, what some of the remarks that I showed you from Fed officials were hinting at is that we're in a similar situation when expected inflation drifts downward. A big point of inflation targeting is to try to keep this pi e, this expected inflation, stable at the Fed's target. So if you keep pi e at 2% because you've told people that the Fed is going to keep inflation at 2% and they believe you, then the real interest rate is always going to be the nominal interest rate minus 2%. And that would be okay, but we've been getting into situations where this nominal interest rate gets down to zero. That's the situation we're in right now, the zero lower bound. When the nominal interest rate is at zero, then the real interest rate with 2% inflation expectations is negative 2%. And sometimes we're in a situation, a bad recession, when we need an even lower real interest rate. So let's talk about this some more. This is the federal funds rate over time. This is the policy rate that the Federal Reserve uses. It's a short-term nominal interest rate. And you can see that it's been on the decline. And you can see how in the Great Recession, here's where the Fed cut the nominal interest rate all the way down to zero. We call it the zero lower bound. And they left it there. They would have liked to have cut it even further to ease economic conditions more, but you can't really cut nominal interest rates below zero. You can cut them a little bit below zero. Some central banks are trying that. The Fed hasn't, they've said that they're not likely to do that, and even if they were to do it, there's still a limit to it. You couldn't have negative 3% federal funds rate, for example. The Fed had just started lifting away from the zero lower bound when we get the pandemic. And then now we're right back at this zero lower bound. So going back to that Fisher equation, if the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus expected inflation, if the nominal interest rate is zero, then the real interest rate is negative expected inflation. If inflation expectations are around 1.8% because the Fed has been consistently undershooting its 2% target, then that means the real interest rate is negative 1.8%. Okay. So if the Fed could convince people that they're really going to have 2% inflation as their target, then they could do a little better. The real interest rate would be negative 2% instead of negative 1.8. And so that is like more stimulating to the economy. But the point of average inflation targeting is to do even more than that. It's when we have some below target inflation, like at the start of this recession, we get some deflation. Well, that makes people expect the Fed to let inflation go above 2% in the future to get the average back to 2%. So if we expect that the Fed is going to make up for the low inflation that's coming from the recession by bringing inflation up to 3% next year, then our expected inflation is 3%, and the real interest rate is negative 3%. So that is more stimulus to the economy than a negative 2% would be. So that's why average inflation targeting is supposed to help stabilize the economy. Okay, it dampens the fluctuations in the economy. Okay, so I'm going to go through some various commentary that I found on the web about average inflation targeting. Some of it came from before the Fed actually made the announcement, when people were already kind of anticipating that it was something the Fed was considering. And so there's tons of commentary about, well, what is this new policy? Is it going to work? What will the challenges be? And I've just kind of, collected a couple of examples of it for you. So this is from David Wessel at Brookings, and this is what he describes as a potential challenge of average inflation targeting. Given that the Fed has been unable to get inflation persistently up to 2%, it might have a hard time convincing people that it can get and keep inflation above 2% for a time. Okay, so maybe it's not that the Fed hasn't been trying to get inflation above 2%. Maybe it's been trying, but it just can't do it. In that case, saying that they have an average inflation target might not convince anyone if we all think, well, they might want to let inflation go up to 3%, but they can't do it even if they want to. So that could be a problem. He also says, even if it did, it might have a hard time convincing people that it wasn't targeting a permanently higher pace of inflation. So if the Fed did manage to get inflation up to 3%, could they convince people that that was going to be a temporary change? He says an even bigger challenge would be periods of above target inflation, after which the Fed would presumably pursue a period of below target inflation. Imagine the Fed chair explaining at a press conference that the Fed was going to raise interest rates and increase unemployment to compensate for a period at which inflation was too high and unemployment was too low. So it could be hard to communicate to the public and to keep people happy if you're telling them, well, we have to tighten policy. We know it'll cause more unemployment, but we had above target inflation, so we need below target inflation now. People wouldn't like that because that would mean tighter policy to get inflation down. Here we have from the Peterson Institute for International Economics a description of average inflation targeting as a weak tool. They give some examples of why they think it would be a weak tool, but here's one. They say average inflation targeting has the potential to produce highly undesirable policy responses at times. This problem is illustrated by the 2006 to 2008 prescriptions of the rule. Because oil prices rose markedly in the years preceding the Great Recession, overall 5-year inflation averaged well above 2% during this period. As a result, this rule would have prescribed holding the federal funds rate near 8%, even as the housing market collapsed, financial stress intensified, and the economy slipped into recession. So since we had higher than 2% inflation before the Great Recession, the Fed would have been shooting for below 2% inflation during the start of the recession, and that would have made the recession even worse, is their argument. Here's David Beckworth again. He says another potential obstacle to credibly implementing the average inflation target is supply shocks. So the negative supply shocks, such as oil shortages, would cause inflation to briefly go up, but remember, they also cause unemployment to go up. The logic of the average inflation target says that any above target inflation created by such shocks would have to be offset by lower inflation at a later time. So we'd be facing a weak economy, and that this policy would prescribe that the Fed should actually tighten policy. to give us below target inflation, even though we might still have high unemployment. Okay, so a better approach would be for the Fed to see through temporary inflation caused by supply shocks. And David Beckworth has written a lot more about the benefits of nominal GDP targeting, which in some ways is similar to average inflation targeting in that it doesn't let bygones be bygones. That's the expression. So letting the Fed's original inflation target let bygones be bygones, in the sense that if there was low inflation in the past, the Fed would just let that be in the past. They'd still shoot for 2% inflation. Average inflation targeting and NGDP level targeting both take the past into account. They don't let bygones be bygones. They try to make up for past misses by getting things on target kind of on an average over time. So if you're interested in why David Beckworth argues for NGDP level targeting instead, you can look up plenty of things that he's written on that, and in particular about why that lets the Fed see through temporary inflation caused by supply shocks. Here is some other commentary from Janelle Mart and Howard Schneider. They've went and seen what different Fed policymakers say about what they actually mean by average inflation. Okay, because if the Fed says it's going to keep inflation at 2% on average, what do they mean? On average over a 5-year period, over a 10-year period, over a 1-year period? If we have low inflation this month, do we need to have high inflation next month? Or is it, are we thinking about longer spans of time than that? Even, is the Fed going to look at the past 10 years of undershooting the inflation target and try to make up for all of that? Or are we only going to try to make up for the last year? So the math that they're talking about, it's not really well defined. They've left it, the exact wording was for some time, I think. So that doesn't really tell us exactly what the Fed's going to do. They didn't give some kind of formula that they're going to use. They didn't say on average over X number of years, we're going to keep inflation at 2%. So it doesn't really allow the markets or the public really to predict what the Fed is going to do. And in particular, different Fed officials have different ideas about what this average even means. From the same article, Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan said he would be comfortable with inflation running a little bit above the Fed's 2% inflation target. And for me, a little bit means a little bit, or about 2.25%, he said. Okay, but St. Louis Fed President James Bullard had a different answer. He said inflation has run below target, certainly by 0.5% for quite a while. So it seems like you could run above for 0.5% for quite a while. So two different Fed policymakers. One says, well, we would let inflation go to 2.25. Another says, oh, sure, we could let it go to 2.5. Okay. There's not even agreement within the committee here. It might actually make things more confusing for the public and for the markets as far as what the Fed is going to be doing. And this is part of a larger issue in monetary policy, this debate over rules versus discretion. The way the Fed has currently phrased its average inflation target gives policymakers a lot of discretion about how exactly they're going to handle it, in particular discretion at any point in time to choose that time horizon of the averaging that they're going to do. They haven't given some kind of rule for how they're going to set the policy rate depending on the inflation history that we've experienced. And this is more than I can get into in this video, but it is one of the big debates in monetary policy, the rules versus discretion debate. And so I think the Fed's adoption of average inflation targeting is going to really reignite that debate, although it never even died down to begin with, but you can expect to be hearing about that. And I think Felicity is deciding that it's about time for me to wrap up this video. I hope it was helpful. You can definitely email me or find me on Twitter at cconsus if you have questions or thoughts about the video. This is a really new policy. I'm sure I'm not covering everything about it. We're going to find out a lot more over the next few months, over the next few years about how it goes. But thanks for listening. Bye.